Welcome to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice, as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We will relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we chose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.
Today we have the honor and the joy of talking to Gina Thomas. She is an author, a mother, a kindred spirit, and just released her newest book, which is Separated by the Border, Birth Mother, Foster Mother, and a Migrant Child's 3,000-Mile Journey. Thank you, Gina, for being here with us today. Your book was released not very long ago. What's been the reaction?
Yeah, it was released October 29th, and it's been pretty positive so far. So it's been really cool to get a lot of messages from a lot of different kinds of people that have resonated with the book. It's been really enjoyable to hear. There's certainly always people who don't like what you do. So there's those people too, and that's okay. But it's been really good. And especially I think a lot of people who are kind of on the outskirts of evangelicalism have responded positively, especially to the NPR interview. So that's been really encouraging too.
Yeah, you've done several of those now, haven't you?
Couple, yeah.
Yeah, incredible. So for those who don't know about, this book was more than just theoretical posture. It was more than just an argument from a theological perspective. It was such an incredibly touching personal story. For those who probably haven't heard, could you give us a quick 3-minute synopsis of what led you to write this book?
Sure. Well, my husband Andrew and I, we became foster parents in October of 2017. And about that same time, there was a family making their way up from Honduras through Mexico and trying to get to the border and into the United States in order to get some money for their family. One of their family members had some pretty big medical issues, and they were trying to get money for that. So about February of 2018, the little girl from this family ended up in our home as a foster daughter, and we found out more and more about the story behind how she had even arrived in our county, and then heard more about her separation first from her biological mother, from the smugglers who had taken the mother as a hostage, and then she was separated by the U.S. government from her stepdad at the border, probably because of zero tolerance policy. We're not 100% sure. So really it was just the story of the mother, and then, the little girl's story, Julia, and then it was a lot of my story and my family's story as well. So I had lived in Honduras, and my family and I had lived in Mexico, and so it was interesting to kind of see our journeys kind of parallel, Honduras, Mexico, and then the United States. So.
Incredible. You wrote in the book a lot more backstory that kind of led you to this point of being a foster parent. What were the big yes moments to fostering that led you to this encounter with Julia?
Yeah, I think, it's funny because I think a lot of times it takes us a while before we get to say yes, right? So I think there were several no moments before getting to those yes moments. When I first heard about fostering, I was like, nope, not happening. When, people talk about how you end up having to, allow the child to go back to their family, a lot of people are like, nope, not going to do that, not going to commit to that. And so it really took a while of recognizing that there were these moments of saying no, and then recognizing why am I saying no to this? And really the motivation behind saying no to foster care was this idea of wanting to possess children. And I think it's a really big idol in a lot of our lives. And it was one that I had to lay down. And so as our family decided, we were trying to adopt in Mexico, and that didn't work. And really, I'm honestly very grateful it didn't work, because I started to think through, like, why are we willing to take care of kids from another culture, but not willing to see, the vulnerable children in our own? And so that really tuned us into foster care. And it was just really hard to say no after that. Yeah.
And as you got kind of deeper into Julia's story and also her mother's, there was obviously a lot of trauma that was uncovered that you had to deal with personally. And there is this thing called secondary trauma stress. And if I could read a definition real quick: the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand trauma experiences of another. So I guess you could be free-ranging in the answer to this. Basically, how did you deal with that? And also, how do you kind of balance, not going off the deep end either way, either succumbing to that stress or just not caring?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I'm living in that tension right now, even still. I deal with it by going to therapy. And yeah, there are definitely times when, throughout the book's process where some of that was harder to handle than other times. When you're writing a book, you got to edit it and you have to reread. If you've read the book, chapter 3 is really, really tough. And so have to reread that over and over again to deal with the grammatical errors and all that fun stuff. And so during that time, it was extra challenging. I think for me, it was recognizing that there are moments where it's okay to turn off the news and to turn off Twitter or whatever else, and not fully consume myself with everything that was going on at the border at the time, because this one was so deep and so heavy on me. I definitely still think I have some of those things, and I want to be careful in saying that, because I think there's certainly this other tension of white privilege that we have to turn off the news, right? And it's easy to just say, well, there's too much going on in the world, I just don't want to even hear any of it. So it's certainly living in a tension, and I think one of the things that I'm learning about this walk with Christ is that it's really about walking those tensions, and most of the time not doing it necessarily well, or not feel like we're doing it well, but to understand that living in the tension is part of the walk of faith, and that it's okay to mess up sometimes. It's okay to go off the deep end sometimes, one way or the other, or to become a hermit sometimes, but you get back up and you trust Christ that he's going to walk through it with you. He's always in the mud with us. I think he's often more in the muddy water than he is on the side where it's safe. So just keeping that in mind, I think, through the process, and surrounding myself with people who are therapists or understand trauma, right? Or and just good friends who know how to ask good questions.
That's so good. You talk about process, and this book was great because it sort of took the reader on a long journey from earlier on in your life until these events transpired. And I really like what you included earlier in the book in a letter to Maria when you were in Honduras the first time. I think one of the most amazing qualities about God is that we find him wherever we are. How have you found him in maybe newer or more unique ways through this process, not just of engaging with Julia and her time here, but also maybe even in writing the book and meeting the people that you've met since that time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of deconstruction that goes on and has gone on with me because of the story and because of even the secondary trauma. I think it's a lot of recognizing who Jesus isn't, who Christ isn't, and we, as much as I have always believed in who I think God is, right? There are definitely things unconsciously that have taught me that God is triumphalistic, or God is Santa Claus, or God is, all these different things that even though I would reject it with my mouth, I still believed it in my heart. And so I think even now I'm still deconstructing some of that process, and really starting to see, God as a migrant mother, or God as a child, or God as, someone who just sits with you and cries, and not necessarily someone who tells you the answers to the life's problems. And so recognizing and understanding God in that way is growing up the way that I had. It's a very challenging thing to do because, God isn't this like what we imagine, the King of Kings, right? Who's all powerful and all knowing and who can accomplish anything that you want him to. And not that he's not that person, but he's also this very humble child who comes to earth in a 15-year-old virgin, right? And so like there's these two aspects of who God is. And so trying to really see a bigger picture of the whole picture of who God is, and understanding that just because I don't feel like I hear him or sense an answer to an issue, that doesn't mean that he's not here, that he's here even when I can't experience him or can't put my finger on the experience. So yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, so good. So as you journeyed with Julia being with your family, and then ultimately this amazing opportunity to go down to see her home and to take her to her home where she came from, what were take us back to that day. What were some of the emotions that were going on, and sort of this full circle picture of restoration at the end of a long and uncertain journey?
Yeah. So we arrived at the airport. It was about 2.5, 3 hours away from where they lived. And so we knew that we would see her mom at the airport. We didn't know if we would see anyone else, but her mom called us on the phone and was like, yeah, we're 5 minutes away. And that kind of turned into 35 minutes. And, it's not that big of a deal when you think about Latino culture, but when you've waited 4 full months for this like moment to happen, it's like, where are you? So every car that pulled up, we're like, scouring down, like, is that them? Are we finally here? We made it. And so there were several different cars that pulled up, and we were trying to find, if it was her. And finally she arrives and comes running out, and Julia was standing next to me and kind of jumping up and down and almost groaning in a way that like I had never heard her groan before. She was just so excited to see her mom, and she looked up at me and was like, can I go to her? And I was like, of course, and I've got my telephone because I'm trying to video this at the same time and like experience it, but also like bring that experience back to people. And so Lupe runs up the stairs, and then Julia kind of meets her at the top of the stairs outside of the big automatic doors, and they just like engulf each other. And if you knew Julia, you would understand how big of a deal it was that she did not leave her mom's lap the whole ride home. Like, this is a girl that does not stop moving and does not stop talking. And, like she's constantly just like full of sass and full of life, right? Can't stay still. And so for her to just sit on her mom's lap the whole ride home was a pretty big deal. But it was really cool to sit in the car next to her mom and talk to her on the way home. And her mom, even in that moment, Lupe has always had just this really amazing perspective, I think. And even in that moment, she said, we just buried a neighbor's son. And, here I am, and I get to experience this joy because my daughter has returned to me. But our community is mourning the loss of this 18-year-old who just recently died, and this mom never gets to see her son again. And so, even that, like the tension that she lives in constantly of like, this is bringing life to her, but she knows that there are hard things all around her and all around her community. And so just to understand that like tethered joy that she has was a really beautiful moment too.
And you deeply connected with Julia's mother along the process and became actually great friends, I think. And I think you had some revelations kind of about not only mothering, from your perspective, but also kind of how universal that is, and even how that involves God. And so I just wanted to, if I could, read really quickly. This is just some like pictures that we have in the Bible of God. And it talks about God in the Old Testament as a bear robbed of her cubs, a mother comforting her child, a woman nursing a baby, And in the New Testament, Jesus, who is the second person of the Trinity and equal with God, likens himself to a hen trying to gather up these chicks. And so there's this really strong picture of, if you will, the feminine nature of God. And so could you talk a little bit about that and kind of all, your realizations about all of that?
Sure. Yeah. Don't want to get y'all in trouble, but
No.
I can get myself in trouble on this topic. It's interesting just kind of growing up in, white evangelicalism as I have, and see, even though I grew up in a church that was egalitarian, it's interesting how often the patriarchy kind of controls the narrative of who God is, and how we accept the idea that God is a him. But when someone says God is she, that it's heretical. I have a blog post that kind of explains exactly my thoughts on this stuff, but I don't think that God has a gender, but I do think that we can understand God better by recognizing the different qualities within genders. And so I feel like this book really showed me, again, God as a migrant mother, and what when it talks about in Romans 8 that there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. I've never thought about that in such a deep and profound way before. Now, having understood what this mother had been through, literally had been through hell in Mexico and was willing to risk going through it again to get to her daughter. And so that tenacious love that really is incomprehensible is just a beautiful picture of who God is, and that God, there is a very, very powerful force. And this is something that I learned just in having other foster kids in our home. There's a very powerful force between a biological mom and her child, regardless of what happens after they give birth, right? That force is strong and it's very deep. And I think that when we can kind of come to understand that a little bit more, we have a better sense and a deeper sense of what God's love really is for us, and that he would be, or she would be, willing to go through hell to bring us into their family. And really that's what the cross did, right? It was God going through hell to bring us into his family. And so to get an actual real life example, modern example of what that is, has been very profound for me, and I think will stay with me the rest of my life.
That's incredible. You were talking about early in the book about becoming a mother while you're in Mexico, and what a profound change that brought. And then going through these encounters of just tremendous motherhood moments. Has that changed you as a mother now?
Yeah, I think it has. I think it will continue to do so. Certainly understanding how easy it is to take for granted the presence of my child, right? My children. I'm an introvert, and so I like my alone time. So sometimes I'm like, please get away from me right now. I just need to be alone. But to understand that, especially living in a country that has forcibly taken children away from their parents, not just during zero tolerance, but we have a long history of it with many different scenarios. And so I think that realization has been quite huge, and that, at trying to really imagine what would it be like for someone to take my child away from me is really deep and profound, and certainly changes one's perspective on not taking for granted your children and the presence in your life. And especially when they're younger, it's just hard. Like, life is just hard with little kids. And so everyone who's older says, like, don't take it for granted, it goes away quickly. And I'm like, nope, not going away quickly. It's like, this is long and arduous. But yeah, seeing the other side to that, even in the midst of, having little kids, I think is super important. And just recognizing that, again, that bond is so strong. And I think when we, as a nation, forcibly take children away from their parents, it's not just inhumane. It's cutting some kind of spiritual tie that we really have no right cutting. Yeah.
In the sort of tone of that, what would be your counsel for Christians here in the Western world that sometimes seek to be immune from the issues that we find in the world, especially at our southern border? What would be a few points of wisdom that you would give to our Christian community that sometimes ignores what's going on?
Yeah. I think, a lot of times we talk about how we are pro-life, right? And I think that as Christians, I fully do believe that, and I believe in that. I do think that we truncate that term, though, to mean one thing, to mean anti-abortion, and I think there's a whole slew of other issues that should be falling under that category. We also talk about how we're pro-family, and for me, zero tolerance was an opportunity for us as Christians to really prove we're pro-family, so much so that we're, calling our senators and telling them that this is not okay, and getting as much active as we can fighting against this very evil thing. So I think it's important for us to pay attention to what's going on at the border. I mean, children are still being separated. And I think that as much as we can, whether it's getting involved in a way that's actually, active and we're there, there are other ways to get involved too. And part of that is starting with our language, not calling people illegals. Like that's inhumane to do. I really do believe that. And just recognizing the little tiny steps that we take, the subtle ways that we dehumanize other people, I think is really important, especially if we're pro-life, right? If we're pro-life, then we're pro-humanity. And so that means we see the Imago Dei in every human being. And in order to do that, we've got to start using the right language. We've got to stop letting other people say things that they shouldn't be saying. And really, as much as we can, we need to be involved in some kind of pro-life activity. I think that's a calling that we all have, whether it's in immigration or racism or, a slew of other possibilities.
That's good. Also, there at the end of your book, you mentioned the idea of lament, and you even lamented throughout the book several times. How do we as Christians lament well, lament proactively, lament in a sort of godly way?
Yeah. I think that Soong-Chan Rah has a wonderful book called Prophetic Lament that every Christian should read. And in it, he talks about how 30% of the Old Testament is lament. And that's not something that we often talk about. It's not something we often do. I mean, even if you look at our worship songs, typically, they're all very triumphalistic. And I think that's kind of, what I was talking about before in this whole like bigger concept of who God is. It's easier for us to see God as king or Santa Claus or, all these other things that, some of them are right and some of them are good and some of them aren't, but it's easier for us to see that aspect of God because we don't lament. And so it's harder for us to see the God who's sitting in the mire, right? The God who is sitting with us in the pit and saying, it's okay. We're going to cry. And that's all we're going to do right now. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think Grisel Medina, who's quoted in the book, talks a lot about how, we need to make space in our churches for ugly cries, right? And for us to be okay with the ugliness that's within us. And I think that's something that we don't do. And I don't know that it's going to come to us naturally. I think we have to be very intentional about making those spaces and recognizing that, even when stuff happens in our country, like, for example, when another Black a man is shot by a police, it's easy for Christians to turn off the sounds of the mother because the mother is angry or cussing or whatever. And we just are like, nope, we can't listen to that. Well, no, like we need to listen to that. We need to imagine what it's like. And we need to be okay with the cuss words that come out because those are real and they're truth in that moment for that person. And really, I just don't believe anymore that God is afraid of our cuss words or afraid of our humanity or afraid of, the things that are real. Now, there are times when we don't need to be cussing. Like I'm not saying like, let's just all go cuss, but I'm saying like, let's be real about how we're feeling about things and not just assume that God can't handle the authenticity that comes from deep pain and deep sorrow.
So the three of us have not only visited other countries, but lived overseas. And in my case, it was Ukraine.
Mm.
And I ran into a metaphor about Americans that I would love to get a response on. So this is actually from a Ukrainian. And he said that Ukrainians are like pineapples and Americans are like unripe peaches.
Hmm.
That Ukrainians are like this prickly fruit on the outside that looks like, oh, I don't want to go near that. But then once you get into it, it's sweet.
Hmm.
But Americans are fuzzy and soft on the outside, but they're hard on the inside.
Mm. Wow. I think that that's correct when we're talking about white Americans, especially white Christian Americans. I'm not sure it's the case when we're talking about Latino Americans or African Americans.
Yeah.
But I do see that, and certainly in our Christian circles too. It's very, especially in the South, right? Especially in the South.
Mm-hmm.
I'm originally from the North, so yeah, it's this like idea that we're going to be wonderful and sweet to each other's faces and then not really care when something big goes wrong. And sadly, I've heard a lot of stories of people who quit going to church after they've gone through something really heavy because the church didn't know how to support them in it. And I think that should grieve all of us. I think we should all be lamenting that.
So do you think that kind of what's happening at the border right now is kind of one symptom of that?
Potentially. It's interesting that we allow what's happening at the border, and by we, I mean generally. There's definitely a lot of Christians, Catholic and Protestant, who are doing a lot of work at the border. But I would say like the bigger voices are not really talking about it. And so it's interesting, though, that we are very willing to send ourselves overseas for 10 days and work with these same people and love them, right? Let's love on them. But then when they're coming here, where's that love? Like it's certainly not unconditional love, that's for sure. So I think there's a lot of truncated versions of the gospel, and I think we're seeing a lot of that, the branches of that kind of come out in the past, 10 years or so.
Okay.
So.
And has there been kind of a clearness committee moment for you in terms of your understanding of the immigration issue?
I would say that for our family, we were aware of things that were happening at the border, especially when the most recent president got in office, because we had a lot of friends in Mexico. We lived there for 4.5 years. And so a lot of our friends are like, how can you guys elect this person? Because based on what he is saying about, Mexicans in general. So we were certainly aware of it. I think that, once Julia came in, and maybe this is where it might flip the clearness committee a little bit on the head, but when Julia came in to our home, it was an automatic, like, well, got to figure this out. Got to know what's going on, like, why did this even come here? And so sometimes it is the child that leads us, right, into understanding better and giving us the wisdom of what, probably what we needed to see all along and what was always there all along, but we hadn't opened our eyes to it. So it really was that. And then, of course, hearing more and more Lupe's story was really just, it's its own horror of it in itself as a personal story. But when you start to realize that this is a systemic issue and this is not just her story, I mean, certainly her story is her story. But there are tons of other stories like this, and just the many ways that women especially are treated on their trip up is just really, really horrifying, lamentable, and really, I really do believe it grieves the heart of God.
Your book is just a true gift to the body of Christ, a gift to the universal church. It is such an awesome picture, I think, into God's heart and sort of an expansion to his identity. So you've written this book. You've recently moved. What's next in the chapter of your family?
We're chilling out. We're here. We've been in Tennessee now about a year and kind of learning how to just be a family of four. It takes a while. We were only a foster family for about 9 months, but I think it takes a while to really kind of process everything that had happened. We had 3 different girls in our home and just really heavy stuff that we walked through. So we don't know what's next. We've talked about maybe fostering again. We've talked about adopting. But at this point in time, it's kind of like that, the whole book talks about, like, just sitting still without answers. It's kind of what it feels like right now. It's just not knowing what's next. But just, being faithful in where we're at. And we're really lucky to be a part of a really great church that has felt like home from the moment we stepped foot in it. And so that's been wonderful and encouraging. And then I have a job that I get to do a lot of really awesome work and use my master's degree. It's amazing. Finally get to use it. So that's been really enjoyable. But just learning to sit still and to be okay with, no movement. And as someone who likes to have adventures, sometimes this is harder, right? So
much harder, honestly.
Yeah.
Before we go, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your heart, for allowing us to chat with you a bit. What's the best way for people to find you? Social media, website, where to get your book?
Yeah. Twitter is probably the best. I'm often on there the most. It's my handle is at Gina L. Thomas and GENA. I just got off Instagram because I'm trying to declutter my life. So don't find me there. I won't respond. And then Facebook as well. The website is just ginathomas.com. And yeah, you can find all the information there, where to get the book and all that stuff. But book is anywhere that you can find books. So if you prefer, I would love for you to buy it from your independent bookstore, but there's Amazon too. So
that works. That's perfect. Thank you so very much. Lord bless you and everything you have ahead. And we so appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.